I doubt she can even reach the keypad, let alone fix it. They looked at me and saw a ghost. A small, quiet girl in an oversized denim jacket. Someone they could brush aside like the dust on our shop floor. But when I told them their unbreakable vault was nothing but a stubborn child waiting to be heard, their smug faces twisted into disbelief. Little did they know that 5 minutes in my presence would mark the beginning of their greatest humiliation. I wasn't just a girl in a failing locksmith stall. I was a prodigy with the technical soul of a craftsman and the determination to watch their empire tremble. They thought my presence was a joke until the steel bolts began to scream. What they didn't realize was that underestimating me was the most expensive mistake they would ever make. My grandfather used to say that a lock never lies to you. He'd spend his mornings hunched over a scarred wooden workbench in the back of our stall, the air thick with the smell of kerosene and WD-40. He'd point a gnarled, oil-stained finger at a disassembled cylinder and say, "Zola, look at the tumblers. A machine doesn't have an ego. It doesn't care about your gold watch, your tattoos, or how many men you have waiting in the car. It doesn't care if you're 12 years old or if you haven't eaten a real meal in 2 days. If a lock is jammed, it's a plea. If it's frozen, it's waiting for someone with the heart to listen." I spent my entire childhood listening. I learned the rhythmic click of a set Ken. I memorized the high-pitched friction of a dry spring. I felt the grinding protest of a forced shackle. But I didn't realize back then that sometimes you have to listen to more than just the iron. Sometimes you have to listen to the silence of the powerful men standing in the room. That's where the real fear hides. I remember the day the world finally stopped being still for me. It was a Tuesday in the slums of the city. One of those heavy, airless afternoons where the smog feels like a wet wool blanket draped over your shoulders. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, deep purples and sickly yellows, and the air tasted like exhaust in the damp concrete of our alley. I was 12 years old, and my entire existence was measured in millimeters, tension wrenches, and the distance between our last customer and the eviction notice on the door. I was covered in a layer of graphite grit that soap couldn't reach anymore. My hands were shaking, but it wasn't because the work was hard. I'd been picking padlocks since I was tall enough to reach the counter. It was because I was hollow. I was hungry for more than just food. I was hungry for a life that didn't feel like a slow metallic death in a forgotten corner of the world. And then, the silence of our alley was murdered by the roar of an engine that cost more than my grandfather's entire life. The heavy, humid air in the stall felt like it was holding its breath as I stepped toward the silver beast in the trunk of the obsidian SUV. Sungmin's laughter still echoed off the rusted corrugated walls, a sharp, jagged sound that smelled of expensive cologne and unearned confidence. He looked at me, then at the digital interface of the safe, his lip curling into a sneer that felt like a slap. "This is the specialist?" he barked, his voice thick with a mockery that treated me like part of the scenery rather than a human being. "The kid looks like she struggles to open a soup can, let alone a pressurized, high-grade lockout system." I didn't argue, and I didn't get angry. My grandfather had taught me that anger is a waste of energy, and energy is the one thing a craftsman can't afford to squander when a job is on the line. Instead, I looked past the noise and locked eyes with Park Do-yoon. His gaze was like a winter morning, clear, freezing, and entirely unreadable. "A machine doesn't have an ego, mister," I said, my voice low and steadier than my heart. "It doesn't have a hidden agenda or a secret life it's trying to keep from you. It doesn't care if the rest of the world thinks you don't belong in the room." The laughter died instantly, replaced by a silence that was heavier than their noise. Do-yoon didn't blink, but I could feel him measuring me, weighing the grit on my hands against the fire in my eyes. He gave a single, almost invisible nod. I leaned into the vehicle, the heat from the engine radiating against my face like a fever. The safe was a masterpiece of carbon fiber and electronics, designed to intimidate anyone who knew how to work on old iron. but every lock follows the same laws of physics. I ignored the bodyguards whispering behind me and the weight of their predatory grace. I closed my eyes, refusing to look with my sight, choosing instead to look with my ears. I listened to the rhythmic thum of the internal processors and the high-pitched whistle of the cooling fans. It took me less than 3 minutes to find the truth hidden in the silence. There was a resonance failure in the secondary solenoid, a microscopic hesitation in a $1,000,000 machine. I adjusted the tension wrench in my back pocket, felt the subtle, satisfying click of the seal, and bypassed the digital lockout with a tactile grace they couldn't comprehend. The heavy door didn't just open, it sang. The mocking smiles vanished as the steel bolt slid back with a perfect, terrifying purr. Do-yoon stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the contents of the safe, then slowly turned his head to look at me. His voice was smooth like expensive whiskey, but it held a demand for understanding. "How?" he asked. I wiped the graphite from my fingers, meeting his gaze without flinching. I told him, "I just listened. Most people are too busy talking to hear what's actually wrong." Do-yoon didn't reach for his wallet, nor did he offer a word of thanks. He simply stood there, his eyes boring into mine as if he were trying to read the blueprints of my soul. Then, with a silence that was heavier than any threat, he turned and began walking toward our crumbling apartment entrance. I yelled for him to stop, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but he ignored me. His expensive shoes groaned against the warped linoleum of the hallway as he reached our door. My grandfather, Mavis, was already there, holding the door open with the quiet, weary dignity of a man who had seen too much history to be impressed by a man in a sharp suit. The apartment was tiny, the wallpaper peeling at the corners, filled with shadows and memories of everyone we had lost. Do-yoon stood in the center of the room, his head almost touching the low, water-stained ceiling. He didn't look at the mismatched furniture or meager belongings. His gaze drifted immediately to the small wooden table in the corner, our shrine. There, among the small candles and the fading funeral programs, was a photograph of my father, Elias. He stayed there for a long time, his back turned to us, staring at my father's face in the frame. I saw his jaw tighten, a flicker of something human and raw crossing that obsidian mask. "Your son?" Do-yoon said, his voice turning into iron. He explained that 20 years ago, when he was just a boy, his own father had been stranded with a vintage fleet in the city. Elias had been the only man in 3 counties who didn't try to cheat them because of their accent. He had been a craftsman who saw the truth of the steel and the truth of the man behind it. Mavis nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, confirming that Elias had carried that weight until the day he died. Do-yoon finally turned back to me, and for a fleeting second, the boss persona was gone. He looked at the holes in our ceiling, the grease on my forehead, and the wrench still tucked in my pocket. He looked like he was making a calculation, not of money, but of a debt of honor that had been accruing interest for 2 decades. "This neighborhood is a graveyard for talent," he said, his voice smooth like whiskey but heavy with a new, terrifying purpose. "And I do not like seeing good tools go to waste. You are coming with me to California, both of you." It wasn't an invitation, it was an extraction, a dismantling of the only life I had ever known to pay a debt I hadn't even known we were owed. The move was not a transition, it was an extraction. Within 48 hours, the Obsidian King had dismantled the only life I had ever known with a mechanical efficiency that was chilling. Park Do-yoon's men, the same predators who had mocked me in the mud, were suddenly transformed into movers, packing our meager belongings into high-grade crates. I spent my final night in the stall, the air thick and still, smelling of the kerosene heater we used in the winters and the stale coffee my grandfather used to leave on the workbench. I sat on the floor, my back against the brick wall, running my fingers over every nick in the wood, Every scratch was a memory of the difference between a flare nut and a hex bolt, and of the day my father told me that a girl who knew how to use her hands would never have to beg a man for anything. Leaving felt like leaving him behind again, as if I were abandoning the only place where his ghost still breathed. But as the sun began to peek through the cracks in the door, Mavis walked in, already dressed in his Sunday best. He told me that my father hadn't built this place to be my cage, but to be my wings. I stood up, wiped the dust from my jeans, and picked up my father's wrench, the only thing I didn't pack in a box. When the black SUV pulled up to the gate, I didn't look back at the house. I looked at the road ahead. The destination was a sensory overload. The air didn't stick to you like it did back home. It felt thin and tasted like possibility. We were driven to a house in the hills that felt less like a home and more like a fortress, all glass and white stone, perched on a cliff that overlooked a world too bright to be real. Do-yoon wasn't there when we arrived, having disappeared back into his world of high-stakes shadows, leaving us with a staff that moved like ghosts. There was a nurse for Mavis and a kitchen stocked with things I'd only seen in movies, but the real shock waited in the library, where a single envelope sat on a mahogany desk. I opened it with trembling fingers to find an admission letter to an elite academy with a financial statement showing a balance of 0. He had paid for everything, every book, every fee, every meal. Standing in that silent, expensive room, I felt a sudden, crushing weight on my chest. This wasn't a gift, it was a test. The first morning in California felt like waking up inside a diamond, cold, sharp, and blindingly clear. I sat on the edge of a bed so soft it felt like a trap, my feet touching a carpet so plush it felt like it was breathing. Back home, the morning was a chorus of cicadas and the distant rumble of freight trains, a world where the air stuck to you like a wet wool blanket. Here, the only sound was the hum of the central air conditioning, a sound so perfect it was almost offensive. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass and looked at the ocean in the distance, a thin strip of mercury reflecting the pre-dawn light. It was beautiful, but it felt hollow. Everything here was too clean, too quiet, as if the world had been scrubbed of its history. I found Mavis in the kitchen, standing small and fragile against a vast landscape of marble. He was staring at a coffee machine that looked more like a piece of lab equipment than an appliance, his hands hovering, as if the wrong move might trigger an alarm. We both knew the truth that hung in the sterile air. This wasn't just a house, and it wasn't just a fresh start. This was a debt. Every polished surface and every silent servant was a line item in a ledger I hadn't yet learned how to balance. I retreated to the library and picked up the admission packet for the academy. Every time I read my name on that heavy, cream-colored letterhead, my stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. I was a girl who fixed tractors in the mud, someone who knew how to bypass a blown fuse with a gum wrapper. I wasn't an engineer, I was a survivor. I looked at the financial statements again, the 0 balance that wiped away a fortune in tuition, books, and lab fees. He had paid for everything. It was then that the reality of Do-yoon's gift finally settled into my bones. He hadn't just moved us, he'd placed me under a microscope. This elite education wasn't a reward for opening a safe, it was an investment he expected to mature. This was a test. He was watching to see if the girl from the slums would shatter under the pressure of the bright world, or if she was truly the good tool he claimed he didn't want to see go to waste. The gilded cage didn't just have bars of gold, it had high-stakes expectations that made the air feel thin. I realized then that if I failed, I wouldn't just be losing a scholarship, I would be proving everyone who ever mocked me right. I would be confirming that the grease under my skin was the only thing that was real. The first day of university felt like a slow-motion car crash. I wore my cleanest shirt and best denim, but I still felt like I was wearing a costume, a girl from the mud playing the role of a scholar. The campus was a forest of olive trees and mid-century architecture crawling with students who moved with a confidence that only comes from never having to wonder where your next meal is coming from. I walked into the Introduction to Mechanical Systems lecture hall, a massive auditorium tiered like a Roman theater, and sat in the back row, trying to make myself as small as possible. The professor, a man with hair the color of brushed aluminum and a voice like a legal brief, began by defining engineering as the art of imposing order on chaos. He started writing long, elegant strings of variables on the board, equations that looked like a foreign language to my eyes. Around me, the air filled with the sound of 1,000 tiny insects as students tapped away at their tablets with sleek styluses. I pulled out my father's old notebook, the one with the frayed edges that still carried the faint, ghostly scent of diesel. I had sharpened my pencil with a pocket knife that morning, a habit of the stall I couldn't seem to break. A girl sitting next to me, wearing a watch that probably cost more than my grandfather's entire locksmith stand, gave my notebook a sidelong glance. She didn't say a word, but her lip curled just a fraction of an inch, a silent, jagged dismissal that felt like a slap. I felt the heat rise in my neck, a burning reminder that I was a stranger in this clean, quiet world. I wanted to tell her that this notebook held more truth than her tablet ever would, that I'd seen these equations in action while she was still in diapers, but I stayed quiet. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely read my own script as I tried to translate the abstract ghosts on the board into the tactile math I knew. In the garage, math was the feel of a bolt reaching its torque limit. Here, it was a hollow simulation. By the third week, the workload was a mountain I was trying to climb with broken legs. I spent 18 hours in the library, surrounded by books on fluid dynamics, yet the more I read, the more I felt like an imposter. I was a survivor trying to learn the language of architects, terrified that the world would eventually see the grease under my skin and realize I didn't belong. My first major breakthrough arrived during a mid-semester lab session that felt like an execution. We were tasked with designing a more efficient cooling system for a high-output electric motor, and the room was a frantic chorus of clicking styluses and humming processors. The other students were obsessed with their software simulations, lost in a digital maze as they tried to find the perfect mathematical model for heat dissipation. I stood at the workbench, staring at the physical prototype. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, but it felt wrong. It looked too busy, too complicated, like a story with too many unnecessary words. I remembered a trick my father taught me back in the humid silence of Tennessee: how to find a leak in a radiator using nothing but a piece of string and a bowl of soapy water. I didn't touch the computer. Instead, I pulled a small bottle of oil from my bag, the same heavy, translucent oil I'd used in the stall, and smeared a tiny drop on the casing of the motor. I turned the power on and watched the way the oil moved. It didn't flow smoothly. It stuttered and pulled in a specific, jagged spot near the rear bearing. The turbulence isn't in the fins, I muttered to myself, the realization settling in my bones. It's in the intake. I took a small file and shaved away a fraction of a millimeter from the edge of the air intake, working by feel rather than by the glow of a screen. When I turned the motor back on, the oil flowed perfectly. The temperature reading on the digital monitor dropped by 15% in less than a minute. Dr. Sterling walked over, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the screen. "Miss Vera, what did you do?" he asked, his voice losing its brushed aluminum edge. The simulation said the intake geometry was optimal. I wiped the oil from my fingers, meeting his gaze with a clarity I hadn't felt since arriving in California. "The simulation doesn't account for the way the air actually feels when it hits the metal," I said. "It's not just a math problem, doctor. It's a friction problem, and friction is personal." For the first time, Dr. Sterling didn't look through me. He looked at me. In that moment, I realized I didn't need to speak their language to be heard. I just needed to show them mine. The crisis arrived in the final semester of my senior year, carrying the force of a gale wind. My capstone project was a high-efficiency, low-thermal signature drone engine, a masterpiece that represented the culmination of everything I had learned, a bridge I had spent 4 years building between the world of raw steel and high-level physics. If it worked, it wouldn't just be a grade, it would be a revolution in search and rescue technology. I stood in the control booth during the final high-altitude simulation, my heart doing that familiar, heavy skip as I watched the telemetry data glow a steady, hopeful green. Then, the world broke. Without warning, the green lines on the screen twisted into a chaotic, jagged red before flatlining into nothingness. The sound of the explosion echoed through the test chamber, a dull metallic thump that felt like a physical punch to my gut. When the smoke finally cleared, I walked into the chamber to find my future reduced to a blackened, twisted mass of scrap metal. 3 years of relentless work and thousands of dollars had disintegrated in a single heartbeat. I didn't cry, I just stood there in the silence, feeling that old weight returning, the sensation of the Tennessee mud sucking at my boots, reminding me of exactly where I came from. I was 23 years old, and I was right back where I started, staring at a broken machine I couldn't fix. I stayed in the lab for 3 days, refusing to eat or sleep, taking the engine apart piece by blackened piece. I was looking for a flaw in the math, a weakness in the materials, or a slip in the assembly, but I found nothing. The design was perfect, the grade of the alloy was top tier, and the execution was flawless, yet it had still exploded. The failures felt personal, a confirmation of every doubt I had ever harbored about belonging in this bright, clean world. I felt like an imposter who had finally been found out, a girl playing dress-up in a lab coat while the real world laughed at her hubris. The pressure that had been building since the day Park Do-yeon extracted me from the slums finally reached its breaking point. I wasn't an engineer, I was just a girl standing over a grave of burnt titanium, terrified that the numbers had finally defeated me. The silence of the lab was deafening, a lonely, high-altitude sound that made the air feel thin and my existence feel like a slow-motion car crash I could no longer avoid. On the 3rd night of my vigil, the shadows of the lab shifted. I didn't hear the door open, but I felt the temperature in the room drop as Park Do-yeon stepped into the pool of yellow light surrounding my workbench. I was hunched over the remains of the fuel injector, my eyes raw from lack of sleep and the stinging realization that physics seemingly betrayed me. "It's not the design, Zola," he said, his voice a cold, steady stream that cut through the cavernous silence of the room. I snapped, my voice cracking from days of disuse, telling him that if a perfect design still explodes, then the world itself is broken. He walked over and picked up a charred piece of the injector, holding it up to the light as if it were a precious stone. He told me that I was trying to build a machine for a laboratory, a place where variables are controlled and the air is clean. But the world is not a laboratory. The world is mud and ionized air and fuel that is never as pure as the math demands. He told me that I was spending 4 years trying to be like them, but they don't know how to fix things when the world breaks. You do. He told me to go back to the garage, not the garage in my head, but the real one where my hands understood the truth of the steel. When he left, I felt the phantom weight of the 10mm wrench in my back pocket, and I realized he was right. I had been trying so hard to be an engineer that I'd forgotten how to be a mechanic. I stopped looking at the digital telemetry and started looking at the metal itself, noticing a slight iridescent blue discoloration on the alloy that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a structural failure, it was a resonance failure. The engine had been vibrating at a frequency identical to the pulse of the fuel pump, creating a feedback loop that tore the metal apart. It was so simple that no computer would have ever flagged it. I redesigned the fuel line, adding a simple weighted damper, a trick I'd seen my father use to stop a vibrating exhaust pipe on an old Ford. When I ran the test again, the engine didn't just survive, it was silent and smooth. I sat on the floor of the test chamber and finally cried, not because I was a failure, but because I was finally truly done. I had stopped trying to impose order on chaos and started listening to the machine again.
Senior year ended in a blur of accolades and job offers that once had felt like a dream. I was the star of the engineering department, the girl from the slums who was now the most sought-after graduate in the state. Offers poured in from NASA, Boeing, and Tesla, but I didn't say yes to any of them. I was waiting for something else, something that didn't involve becoming another cog in a corporate machine. Mavis was busy preparing for graduation, glowing in a soft lavender silk dress that made her look like a spring flower. When I looked at her, I saw my father in her eyes, and I knew this degree was the completion of the work he had started in that dusty, kerosene-scented stall. Lee remained a constant shadow, standing in the back of the auditorium during the ceremony, a silent sentinel watching the world he had built for me come to life. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about propulsion systems or carbon footprints. I told the sea of faces about a man who taught me that being an engineer isn't about the math, but about the heart. After the ceremony, away from the noise of wide-eyed PhDs, Lee handed me a simple white envelope. It wasn't another tuition bill, but a deed to a shop in the city, a high-end restoration firm. He told me that while I had the mind of a scientist, I have the hands of a craftsman, and the world didn't need more equations, it needed someone who could fix what was broken. I opened Bennett and Park Restoration 6 months later. We didn't do ordinary repairs. We took the broken masterpieces of the world, the vintage Italian engines and one-of-a-kind prototypes, and brought them back to life. I hired the kids from the old neighborhood, the ones who knew how to listen to the metal instead of just the simulations. We became the most prestigious shop on the coast, a place where billionaires had to wait in line for the girl with the 10-millimeter wrench. The introduction of Julian happened on a rainy Tuesday when he brought in a wrecked 1960s Alfa Romeo. He told me he was told I was the only one who could hear it, and in that moment, I knew he was the one. Our wedding was held in the garden of the Glass Fortress, and as Lee walked me down the aisle, I could feel the pride in his step. He whispered for Julian to keep my heart running, or he would find him. As the sun set over the Pacific, I touched the 10-millimeter wrench tucked into the folds of my wedding dress. My father was right. An engine never lies to you, but a life is a beautiful, broken machine. As long as you have the heart to listen, you can always find a way to fix it. I was finally home, and the engine was running perfectly.